The morning sun filtered through the large windows of Atlanta International Airport, casting long shadows on the gleaming floor. Jordan Blake, wearing a casual navy blazer and well-worn jeans, walked purposefully through the bustling terminal. His leather messenger bag, a gift from his father on his first day as a licensed pilot, hung at his side. At 35, Jordan had seen the world from 35,000 feet more times than he could count. But today, he was just a passenger, attending an aviation conference in Denver. He cherished these rare moments to step back and observe the industry he loved from a different angle. Jordan approached the check-in counter for first-class passengers. As always, he avoided mentioning his status within the company. He enjoyed flying incognito. It reminded him of what it felt like to be just another traveler. The check-in agent, a young woman with a warm smile, handed him his boarding pass with a polite, "Have a great flight." After clearing security, Jordan wandered toward a coffee shop, stopping to admire a large advertisement for Skyline Airways, the company his father had built from a small regional carrier into one of the country's most respected airlines. The tagline read, "Soaring together, where everyone belongs." Jordan smiled at the sentiment. It was a vision he deeply believed in, though he knew the reality didn't always match the marketing. As one of the airline's few black pilots, he had experienced his share of microaggressions and assumptions. But today wasn't about work, it was about observing, learning, and quietly representing everything his father had taught him about grace and humility. Jordan sipped his black coffee as he watched the hustle and bustle of the airport. Across the terminal, a little boy pressed his hands against the glass, his eyes lighting up as he watched planes taxi on the tarmac. Jordan smiled at the sight, remembering the days when he was that boy, dreaming of taking to the skies. His phone buzzed with a text from his father. "Dad, proud of you. Son, safe travels. Call me after the conference." Jordan typed a quick reply. "Jordan, thanks. Dad, will do. Love you." Boarding time arrived, and Jordan made his way to Gate 15. The familiar sight of a Skyline Airways Boeing 737 MAX gleamed under the morning light. A few passengers glanced at him as he approached the first-class line. He nodded politely, aware of the unspoken curiosity in their eyes. Was it the blazer, his confident stride, or perhaps they wondered if he was someone famous? Jordan had long since stopped guessing. "Good morning, sir," said the gate agent, scanning his boarding pass. "Enjoy your flight." Jordan walked down the jet bridge, taking in the faint scent of jet fuel and the hum of distant engines. As he stepped onto the plane, he greeted the flight attendant stationed at the door. "Welcome aboard," she said with a bright smile, though her eyes lingered on him for a beat longer than usual. Jordan found his seat in 2A, tucking his messenger bag into the overhead compartment. Settling into the plush leather seat, he leaned back and allowed himself to relax. The first-class cabin was only partially full. Across the aisle, an older man in a tailored suit was already immersed in his laptop. Behind Jordan, a young woman in yoga pants and a hoodie scrolled through her phone. Everyone seemed engrossed in their own world, and Jordan welcomed the anonymity. He pulled out his phone to check the day's conference agenda. As he scrolled through the panel topics, his excitement grew. Discussions on sustainable aviation, AI in flight operations, and fostering diversity in the cockpit were all on the schedule. The boarding process continued smoothly until a flight attendant named Claire approached. Her professional smile faltered slightly as her eyes scanned Jordan's seat and then his face. "Excuse me, sir," Claire said, her tone polite but tinged with something Jordan couldn't quite place. "May I see your boarding pass?" Jordan raised an eyebrow but complied, pulling up the mobile pass on his phone. Claire studied it for a moment, her brow furrowing. "There seems to be a mistake," she said, lowering her voice slightly. "This section is reserved for first-class passengers." Jordan's calm demeanor didn't waver. "I understand. This is my seat, 2A. Claire's smile tightened. "Perhaps there was an error during check-in. Let me help you find your correct seat in economy." The businessman across the aisle glanced up from his laptop, his expression curious. The woman behind Jordan paused mid-scroll, tilting her head slightly as if sensing the tension. Jordan took a slow breath. He had encountered moments like this before, and every time, he had to choose between making a scene or handling it with quiet dignity. "I fly with Skyline frequently," he said evenly. This is my assigned seat." Jordan's words hung in the air, measured and calm, but Claire's expression remained uncertain. Her professional demeanor now seemed caught in a tug-of-war between doubt and protocol. "I understand, sir," she said, her tone sharpening slightly, "but we'll need to sort this out before takeoff. Let me check with the gate agent to confirm your seat." Jordan sighed inwardly, noting the discomfort rippling through the cabin. He had no intention of escalating the situation, but neither was he going to let this slide. Before Claire could turn away, he spoke, his voice steady but firm. "You're welcome to double-check, but I assure you, this is my seat," Jordan said, gesturing to the boarding pass still displayed on his phone. "I'm not moving." The businessman across the aisle leaned back in his seat, openly observing now. The woman in yoga pants behind him whispered to the passenger next to her, while an elderly couple a few rows ahead turned their heads, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. The previously serene atmosphere of the first-class cabin was quickly unraveling. Claire hesitated, clearly unprepared for such measured resistance. "I'll be right back," she said, her voice faltering slightly as she walked briskly toward the front galley. Jordan exhaled slowly, leaning back in his seat. He wasn't new to this. The assumptions, the double-checking, the quiet insinuations, they came with the territory. His father had once told him, "You'll face moments when people question your place. Son, the key is to know you belong, no matter what anyone else thinks." He glanced out the window at the tarmac below, watching the ground crew work in perfect synchronization to prepare the plane for departure. Their focus, their efficiency, everything about it reminded him of the cockpit, where precision and teamwork left no room for bias or assumptions. Yet here he was, in the cabin he helped design, facing a subtle but all too familiar challenge. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as Claire returned, accompanied by another flight attendant. The second woman, whose name tag read Evelyn, appeared older and more experienced. Her expression was composed, though her eyes flicked quickly between Claire and Jordan, assessing the situation. "Good morning, sir," Evelyn began, her tone professional but warmer than Claire's. "My colleague mentioned there might be some confusion about your seat assignment. Could I take a look at your boarding pass?" Jordan nodded, pulling up the pass once more. "Here it is," he said, tilting his phone so Evelyn could see the screen clearly. "Seat 2A, first class." Evelyn studied the pass carefully, her expression neutral. After a moment, she nodded, turning to Claire. "It's valid," she said softly, her tone leaving no room for debate. Claire's cheeks flushed, and she shifted uncomfortably. "I just wanted to be sure," she said quickly, glancing around the cabin as if looking for support. "Of course," Jordan replied, his voice steady but tinged with an edge of disappointment. "I appreciate your diligence. I only wish it felt consistent." Evelyn's gaze flicked back to Jordan, her brow furrowing slightly as she picked up on the unspoken meaning behind his words. "Mr." She hesitated, clearly unsure of his last name. "Blake," Jordan supplied. "Jordan Blake. Well, Mr. Blake, I apologize for the misunderstanding," Evelyn said, her tone more sincere now. "Please don't hesitate to let me know if there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable." Jordan nodded politely, but the unease in the cabin lingered. Claire muttered a quiet apology before retreating to the galley, leaving Evelyn to smooth over the tension. The businessman across the aisle, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "Handled that well," he said, nodding at Jordan. "Better than I would have." Jordan offered a faint smile but said nothing, turning his attention back to the window as the plane began to taxi. The engines hummed beneath them, a familiar and comforting sound. But Jordan's mind was elsewhere. He could feel the weight of the other passengers' gazes, their silent questions and assumptions hanging in the air. As the plane climbed to cruising altitude, the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. Drinks were served, laptops opened, and headsets slipped on, but the earlier confrontation lingered like a shadow over the first-class section. Behind him, Jordan heard the woman in yoga pants whisper to her seatmate. "I can't believe that just happened," she said. "He showed his ticket. Why did she push it?" Her companion, an older man with a gruff voice, replied, "Happens more often than you'd think. People see what they expect to see." The words hit Jordan harder than he expected. He leaned back in his seat, staring at the seatbelt sign above him. He had spent years navigating spaces where he wasn't the expected face in the room. But it never got easier. Each moment like this chipped away at the armor he'd built, leaving a faint but persistent ache. "Excuse me," a voice said softly. Jordan turned to see the woman in yoga pants leaning forward. "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened earlier. And I'm sorry you had to go through that." Jordan nodded, appreciating her sincerity. "Thank you," he said. "It's not the first time." "Unfortunately." The woman's brow furrowed. "That doesn't make it okay." "No," Jordan agreed. "It doesn't." The businessman across the aisle chimed in. "You handled it better than most would. I'll give you that." He extended a hand. "James Whitaker, corporate attorney." "Jordan Blake," Jordan replied, shaking his hand. James leaned back in his seat, studying Jordan with a newfound curiosity. "Blake, huh? You wouldn't happen to be related to Henry Blake, would you?" Jordan hesitated for a moment before nodding. "He's my father." James let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be." Henry Blake is a legend in the industry. Built this airline from the ground up, didn't he? "He did," Jordan said simply, though his voice carried a note of pride. James shook his head, a wry smile on his lips. "Funny, isn't it? The son of the airline's founder gets questioned in first class. If that doesn't tell you something about how people think." Jordan didn't reply, but his silence spoke volumes. The quiet hum of the airplane engines filled the silence between Jordan and James. Across the cabin, passengers stole glances at Jordan, their curiosity evident. Some looked sheepish, others thoughtful, but no one seemed to want to meet his gaze directly. Jordan could feel the tension beginning to dissipate, though a residue of unease lingered. These moments always left their mark. And it wasn't just the stares or whispers, it was the sheer predictability of it all. He had come to expect these interactions in spaces where he was constantly questioned, where his presence seemed to challenge unspoken rules. The woman in yoga pants, who had introduced herself earlier as Rachel, leaned forward again, her curiosity evidently piqued. "If you don't mind me asking," she said softly, "what do you do for a living? You seem so calm about everything." Jordan hesitated for a moment, weighing how much to reveal. He rarely liked to draw attention to himself. But after what had just happened, it seemed pointless to stay anonymous. "I'm a pilot," he said simply, "for this airline." "Actually." Rachel's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Seriously? That's amazing. You're so young." Jordan smiled faintly. "Started pretty early. My dad used to take me to the hangars when I was a kid. Got my pilot's license as soon as I could and worked my way up." Rachel's face softened, admiration evident. "That's incredible. I mean, I know there aren't a lot of black pilots. You must have worked twice as hard to get where you are." Jordan didn't deny it. "It's a challenge, for sure, but I love what I do. I just wish moments like earlier weren't so common." Rachel nodded, her expression clouded. "I can't imagine what that's like. But honestly, the way you handled it? You got more patience than I ever would." James, who had been listening closely, chimed in. "It's not just patience, it's strategy. You didn't make a scene, but you didn't let it slide, either. That takes, I don't know, balance." Jordan chuckled lightly. "Balance, patience, strategy, it's all part of the job. Flying teaches you that." As the flight reached cruising altitude, the flight attendants resumed their service. Jordan noticed Claire moving cautiously through the aisle, her earlier confidence replaced by nervous energy. She avoided eye contact with him as she passed, her movements deliberate and measured. Sarah, the senior flight attendant, approached Jordan's seat a few minutes later. Her demeanor was calm but apologetic. "Mr. Blake," she said softly, leaning slightly toward him, "I want to apologize again for what happened earlier. That's not the kind of experience we want any of our passengers to have. Especially on our airline." Jordan met her gaze, noting the sincerity in her tone. "I appreciate that, Sarah, but it's not just about me. These moments happen more often than you might think." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're right, and it's something we need to address, more than just a quick apology." Before Jordan could respond, James leaned across the aisle. "You know," he said, addressing Sarah, "if this gentleman hadn't handled himself the way he did, this could have been a much bigger deal. You're lucky he's as composed as he is." Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly, but she nodded in agreement. "We are lucky," she said, turning back to Jordan. "I've been with this airline for over 15 years. And I've seen a lot. But it's a reminder that we can't take respect for granted." We have to work at it. Jordan appreciated her honesty, but he also knew words alone wouldn't fix the problem. It starts with awareness, he said, recognizing our biases, even the unconscious ones. That's the first step. Sarah nodded again, clearly taking his words to heart. I'll make sure this is addressed with the crew. And, thank you for your patience. As Sarah moved to the galley, Rachel leaned forward once more. So, she said with a curious smile, are you going to tell her who you really are? Jordan hesitated, then shook his head. It's not about that, he said. If she only changes her behavior because she knows who I am, then she hasn't really learned anything. James nodded in agreement. Smart move, he said, but still, part of me wishes you'd pull out that ace card. Just to see your face. Jordan smiled faintly but said nothing. He didn't need the validation. He had already made his point. The cabin's energy shifted as the flight continued. Passengers who had previously been silent began to engage in quiet conversations, their voices carrying a mix of reflection and unease. It was clear that the earlier incident had left an impression, and Jordan could see the gears turning in people's minds. Rachel pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. I'm jotting this down, she said, glancing at Jordan. I work in our, and we're always looking for real-world examples for our diversity training. What happened today? This is exactly the kind of thing people need to see. Jordan raised an eyebrow. It's one thing to talk about it in a training session, he said. It's another to live it. Rachel nodded, her expression serious. Exactly. That's why stories like yours are so important. People need to understand what this looks like in real life. James, who had been sipping his coffee, set his cup down with a sigh. You know what I keep thinking about? He said, addressing no one in particular. How many times have seen something like this happen and just stayed quiet? It's uncomfortable to realize. Margaret, the elderly woman seated a few rows ahead, turned in her seat. It's never too late to start speaking up, she said, her voice gentle but firm. That's what I tell my grandson. He's mixed race and starting college this year. I worry about him facing moments like this. But I also tell him to stand tall. Just like you did, young man. Jordan offered her a grateful smile. Thank you, ma'am. And tell your grandson, aviation could always use more people like him. Margaret beamed, nodding approvingly. I will. As the plane glided steadily through the air, the cabin became a hub of introspection and hushed conversations. Passengers, who had initially seemed to retreat into their private spaces, now found themselves compelled to engage, spurred on by what they had witnessed. Jordan noticed that Claire had stayed at the back of the plane since her last awkward interaction. Sarah, meanwhile, made periodic rounds through the cabin, her interactions more deliberate and thoughtful. Rachel, still seated behind Jordan, continued scribbling notes on her phone. James, the businessman, had now fully closed his laptop. Leaning back in his seat, clearly deep in thought, Rachel leaned forward again, her voice quiet but firm. You know, Jordan, what struck me most about all this is how easily it could have gone unnoticed if you just let it slide. If you decided it wasn't worth the effort to challenge her. Jordan turned to her, meeting her gaze. That's the thing about moments like this. It's not just about me. It's about the next person who might not have the same confidence or patience. If I don't push back, even politely, the cycle continues. Rachel nodded thoughtfully. I've seen it happen in corporate settings too. Little moments that no one addresses. And they snowball into a culture where people feel excluded. But seeing you handle it the way you did, that's what real leadership looks like. James chimed in, his voice carrying the weight of his years of experience. Leadership through example. That's rare these days. Most people either explode or stay silent. You found the middle ground. Jordan shrugged, his expression calm but firm. I've had practice. James studied him for a moment, then leaned forward. You know what? I think you should be running a diversity program for this airline. Not just flying the planes. Jordan chuckled. I'll leave that to the experts. I'm just a pilot who happens to care about how people are treated. As the flight progressed, the cabin atmosphere shifted further. Passengers began talking across aisles, sharing their own experiences of bias, prejudice, or moments of introspection. Margaret, the elderly woman, shared a story about how her Chinese daughter-in-law had faced discrimination at a country club. James recounted a time he had witnessed a colleague be dismissed in a meeting, only to have the same idea praised when someone else brought it up. It's subtle sometimes, James said, not outright hostility, but those little moments that pile up. You can see it in people's faces, the way it wears them down over time. Rachel nodded. Exactly. That's why we focus on unconscious bias in training. It's not always about intent, it's about impact. Darren listened quietly, appreciating the candor but also noting how much more work needed to be done. He thought of the young pilots he mentored, many of whom had confided in him about their struggles to feel like they belonged in an industry that still lacked diversity. Awareness is a start, Jordan said finally, but action matters more. Conversations like these are great, but they need to lead to change. Rachel gestured to her phone. Well, I'm definitely going to use this as a case study in my next workshop. Of course, I'll leave out names and details. But the scenario, it's too powerful not to share. Jordan smiled faintly. Just make sure the takeaway isn't about me. It's about the culture we all contribute to. The plane began its gradual descent as the captain's voice came over the intercom, reminding passengers to prepare for landing. The cabin buzzed with a newfound energy, one that Jordan rarely experienced on flights. It was as though the earlier tension had been replaced by a collective determination to be better, to reflect on their own behaviors and assumptions. Sarah approached Jordan's seat one final time, her demeanor more relaxed but still professional. Mr. Blake, I just wanted to say, I've been thinking a lot about what happened earlier, and I hope you know this isn't how we want our airline to represent itself. Jordan met her gaze, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. I appreciate that, Sarah, and I can tell you care. It's moments like these that remind us all to do better. Sarah hesitated, then added, I've already spoken to the crew about it. I think this is something we need to address more openly in our training sessions. Jordan nodded. It's a good start. As Sarah stepped away, Jordan noticed Claire hovering at the edge of the cabin. Her expression conflicted. After a moment, she stepped forward, clearly working up the courage to speak. Mr. Blake, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I wanted to apologize. I shouldn't have assumed, well, anything. It was unprofessional, and it was wrong. Jordan regarded her quietly, letting her words settle. Thank you, Claire. Apologizing isn't easy, but it's a good first step. Claire nodded, her eyes brimming with emotion. I've been thinking about what you said, about respect not depending on status. You're right, it shouldn't take knowing who someone is to treat them properly. Jordan gave her a small smile. The fact that you're reflecting on it means a lot. What matters now is what you do next. Claire nodded again, then stepped back, visibly relieved. Around the cabin, passengers who had been pretending not to listen exchanged knowing glances, their respect for Jordan growing with every interaction. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Jordan couldn't help but reflect on the journey. What had started as a simple flight had turned into a teachable moment, not just for Claire, but for everyone in the cabin. Passengers began gathering their belongings, and Jordan noticed how many stopped to acknowledge him on their way out. Margaret gave him a warm smile and a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Rachel handed him her business card, promising to stay in touch. Even James, the usually reserved businessman, offered a firm handshake. Keep leading by example, James said. You're making a bigger impact than you realize. As Jordan stepped off the plane, he was greeted by the captain, who had evidently heard about the incident. Mr. Blake, the captain said, his tone respectful. On behalf of the crew, I just want to say thank you. Your patience and grace, well, it's something we can all learn from. Jordan nodded, appreciating the gesture but not lingering on it. He had a conference to attend and plenty to think about. Months later, Jordan's experience on that flight had ripple effects far beyond what he could have imagined. The airline introduced new diversity training programs, incorporating real-world examples like the one Jordan had lived through. Rachel invited him to speak at a corporate conference on unconscious bias, where his story inspired professionals across industries to reflect on their own assumptions. And Claire? She became one of the airline's most vocal advocates for change, using her own experience as a flight attendant to educate others about the importance of treating every passenger with dignity. As for Jordan, he continued flying, mentoring young pilots, and quietly leading by example. On one flight, a young black boy approached him in the terminal, wide-eyed and full of dreams. Are you really a pilot? The boy asked. Jordan crouched down, meeting the boy's gaze with a warm smile. I am. And you can be, too. In that moment, Jordan realized that every small action, every quiet stand, had the power to inspire change, not just at 35,000 feet, but in every corner of the world.